Hi, welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name's Steve Burgess. I'm broadcasting from my home in St. George, Utah.
And I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario.
So at Fundamental Freedoms, we are out to prove three things. It's okay to come to a conversation not armed to do battle. It's okay to change your mind and evolve with your ideas. And it is okay, absolutely okay, to have great respect for those that you passionately disagree with.
We also try to abide by two sort of guiding rules in our conversations. One is that we avoid undefined they statements, so that if we ever use the word they, that we try to be very clear about what it is we're talking about and who. And the second general rule is that we remind ourselves that we are individuals. Our guests, whenever they are with us, are also individuals. We're not speaking on behalf of a collective or behalf of a group, despite our affiliations or memberships. In these conversations, we are individuals speaking for ourselves only. If you like what we do here, please connect with us at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. You can hit the subscribe and like button to be notified of streams whenever we go online. We've tended to do this about once a week, but it's ad hoc, so there's no particular schedule. It's best if you just click that subscribe button and be notified when we go online. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks. So this evening, we're doing one of our connection series. This is where we speak with friends and family and fans. And tonight, my sister, Sue Sexsmith, will be with us. What can I say? She's my sister. We grew up together, fought like cats and dogs for about 18 years, and then went our separate ways as we went into our adult lives. And we live pretty far apart. Sue's still up in Edmonton, Canada, and I'm down here in Utah. So we don't get to see each other in person very often, but so I look forward to having a chat with Sue tonight.
I'd like to add that, as many of you might know already, Steve and I went through school together, and of course I was in the same school with his younger sister, Sue, but I haven't seen Sue in probably 30 years. It's been at least, many decades. This is literally the first time I get a chance to talk with her since we were in high school, probably, or even middle school. So it's really great to have her with us tonight. How about I bring her on screen and she can
Let's do
introduce
that.
herself? Hi, Sue.
Hi,
Up here.
everybody.
Yes,
How you guys doing?
very well.
Great. Thanks for coming on with us.
Thank you for having me.
So
Steve,
anything you'd like to
yeah,
tell the audience about yourself?
Um, I don't know. As Steve said, his younger sister. I would definitely agree with the sentiment. We definitely fought like cats and dogs for a lot of years, and have lived pretty different paths through our adulthood by virtue of a whole bunch of different choices that each of us have made. And yeah, I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and kind of doing my own thing these days, I guess.
so before we went online here and streamed, we did have just a brief few minutes to talk about a frame for our conversation tonight. Steve, you articulated something that I think could be a good launch pad for the discussion. Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, well, with Susan's permission, we kind of came to a real impasse. I would call it maybe 6 months or so ago, where you know our personal relationship was really starting to deteriorate. I felt, and it had a lot to do with trolling and posting and disagreeing and arguing on Facebook mostly. Sue would post something, I would disagree, and I would post something, she might disagree, and it really really started to take it personally. And it wasn't until we took the time to get on the phone together or do a video chat where we could actually speak to each other live that we were able to kind of normalize that relationship. And so I thought that might be an interesting thing for us to discuss is, how does that work? I believe that a lot of families are struggling with that. I see that online. I see, families that I know personally disagreeing with each other, and it gets really heated to the point where I feel like it starts to disintegrate their relationships. And that being one of our core tenets that we're trying to deal with and to work on at Fundamental Freedoms is the idea that we can disagree and still have a lot of respect for each other. And in fact, it's important. We say good society is based on good conversations and honest debate. So with that, I think that's the discussion.
Sue, would you mind maybe articulating that same story, but from your perspective?
For sure, for sure. I think Steve really did hit it on the head quite well. The dynamic of having very different, very diverse opinions that when you're presenting them, in kind of the snippets that we often present when we're talking about social media, it very quickly became a snippet and then a snippet and then a snippet, and they were very polarizing snippets. And from my side of the table, it just felt safer, smarter, and just as a better mental health choice to just step back and say, I don't want to participate in those conversations. And by virtue of that, it was just safer, healthier, better for my mental health to say, I don't want to participate in any conversations with that person. Which is pretty sad because Steve's my only sibling. So, ideally I'd like to talk to him at least sometimes.
So do you think do you think there's something inherent in the design of Facebook that, like, Facebook obviously isn't responsible for those behaviors, right, but is there something about it that enhances those behaviors, do you think?
I think it is the ease with which we can share memes, snippets. Twitter's probably no different, but I'm not really a Twitter user. But anywhere where we are presenting a concept or an idea in such a little box, I think it's really easy for people to become polarized. I'll post things that at a quick glance I look at and go, I like what that says. I believe in the basic idea of that. And it only takes a moment for me to hit share and send it out into the world. And I may not have even sat and pondered all the implications of what that message or that box says to me, let alone what other people may perceive out of it who come from very diverse ideas and backgrounds to me. So I think that in and of itself kind of propagates that easy polarization of it, is because we are just doing a snippet. It's a soundbite. It's probably worse than a soundbite because it's not even our own thoughts and words in most cases, right? It's a, wow, that's a great idea. And we throw it out there without any deeper thought to it. And when somebody comes back at you with a very polarized opinion to that, I think it doesn't take long to get into a back and forth of sound bites, which, yeah, I think just propagates it from there.
There's like a
I think
low
the
fidelity level of responsibility when we just share a meme, and but that's actually how memes grow and evolve and propagate.
I
Interesting.
think the perception of anonymity too, because it's not anonymous when you're engaging in conversation or uh, meme lobbing or whatever you want to call it online. It's often with people that you know, even real life relationships. I've been in that situation. Have you ever had an experience like that where you know, get into some kind of battle with somebody ideologically on Facebook, and then you see them at church or at school or at work, and all of a sudden it's like, and quite often what I find interesting is quite often it's just understood. Well, that was online. And so we're not going to discuss that because we know that it would get heated or whatever. So we'll save that battle for online. And when we're together face to face, having to look each other in the eye, we'll talk about the weather. And which is sad. Really, I mean, because face to face, in person, being able to read each other's body language, I mean, that's where passionate conversation should happen. That's where we ought to be able to really express our views and learn things from each other, because you don't learn much with meme lobbing or, trolling or,
Yeah.
backbiting
I
online.
think there's another interesting layer on what you're saying too, though, Steve, which is that when you're communicating face to face with people and you have the body language and all of the pieces that go along with that, you can read that and you can show respect back. When you are reacting to a soundbite, a meme, a comment that was lobbed, you can overlay that with any of your own personal stuff you want to lay on, right? If I've had a really bad day at work and you make a comment that I disagree with, there's a really good chance I'm going to take that worse than if I just had a really good day at work. And I have zero other input from you except for those typed words to interpret it how I want. When I'm communicating with you live, well, I have tone and I have body language and I have all those pieces that help me understand if you're saying it to me with respect, if it's a question, if it's that authoritative older brother, hey, you need to listen comment, right? When I read it on Facebook, it's almost always that, hey, I'm the older brother who knows better comment. So, I think that's the other piece of it, is we've removed so much of the communication when that becomes the method of trying to communicate.
That's interesting. So, because it's understood when you're face to face, there's a totality of communication, and online, it's just these drips, and
Yeah.
then we have maybe a human predilection to interpret those little drips into an entire personality,
Yeah.
which may or may not be what was intended, which may or may not be accurate, and that's interesting. Yeah.
And I think that's especially true when we start talking about, really polarizing issues. If I put up a meme that says black cats are great, you're a dog owner, you may not agree, but I doubt anything you say is really going to deeply offend me about that.
Right.
But when we start talking about deeper values, deeper issues, things that hit us on a grander scale that require more thought personally to understand where we're coming from and what we think of them, I think it's a lot easier to do exactly what you were saying, where it sort of propagates out a whole personality to the other person, where I've now, I have labeled you with this, this, and this because you said this one word, which is, not very productive to having a good conversation with anybody.
Okay, so I want to throw just stir up the pot a little bit, because it seems like we all have common ground about this particular matter, right? It's something about social media makes interactions very, let's say that the flash point is low. It's very easy for things to blow up and escalate quickly. For example, recently I learned of this concept called Godwin's Law. I don't know if you're familiar with Godwin's Law. Something like the longer a conversation carries out online, the closer you get to Hitler.
Oh, okay.
So it always deteriorates into that.
Yeah, so every dispute will always gravitate there. But so we have this common ground that there's something difficult about online interactions. Where, if you don't mind, maybe the two of you share, where did the two of you find that you did not have common ground and that things got tense? Like, any concrete examples of that? Do you want to explore that?
I don't think it'd be too hard to find an example of that. Where would you like to go with that one, Steve? I feel like there's lots of options.
Well, I mean, it's mostly political. I think, and political. I mean, deeply political and really social too, in terms of our political differences. I don't know how Sue got so off track. She grew up with a great example in the home, and somehow she's turned into some kind of liberal nut job. And I don't know how that occurred, but
shots over the bow. Okay, there we go. Let's get this started then.
It's it's funny.
On Facebook that if he made the comments, now I'd be saying, well, I'm not going to talk to you about this anymore, Steve, and turn off notifications. So obviously there's a difference with doing it live. So
it's true. But okay, so that's part of the reason Steve and I wanted to create this venue, even just for he and I to have some difficult conversations. But so welcome. Let's have a difficult conversation if we can.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's, I think Steve's right. I think that is one of the really big broad stroke differences between us. Obviously we grew up in the same house. A lot of the same ideals and concepts and belief systems were modeled for us. And somewhere along the line, I wandered off down the path untaken.
May I offer a topic, perhaps? Because, Sue, I know you're in Edmonton.
Yeah.
And Edmonton this past week has decided to mandate mask laws.
Yes.
Not just for flattening the curve for the next 2 weeks, not just through this flu season, a full year. Sorry, 1 full year, right? Is that the law?
It sounds right. I'll be honest. I haven't. There's been recent law restriction changes that I was more focused on. So,
Well, we can talk about those if you want to bring them up, but I was astounded that the counselors looked into some crystal ball and thought masks will absolutely be necessary in next June, next August, next
Right.
September, and that they had the hubris to make this law for the next 1 year. And I mean, so I'm wearing my opinion on my sleeve there. I wonder, what's your take on that as a person that lives in the city and as Steve says, is quite liberal minded?
Yeah, I think that try not to put my foot too far down my own mouth here. I think that Alberta is a very conservative base here, and I lean very heavily in a different direction. And for me, I don't have an issue with being told that we should wear masks to keep people safe. Um, and I am of the mind that if they want to tell us right now, okay, we're going to do this for a year, great. And if 6 months from now, the picture in the world has changed and the picture in Edmonton and Alberta has changed, they have every capacity to come back and go, okay, we don't need to have that in place anymore. We don't need to try to enforce that. We can take it right off the books. Whatever they want to do with it at that point, I don't disagree with proactively warning people, this is where we are and this is where we expect to be for the next year. That for me feels more comfortable than, well, do this for a couple of weeks, because there'll be a whole lot of people who maybe will do it for the couple of weeks and will instantly stop and say, okay, that's the end point. And we won't get any buy-in after that. So for me, I'm not that uncomfortable with the idea of erring on the side of going potentially a little too far, knowing that we can pull it back when we can.
That's a really interesting take, because that's one thing that's been a source of real frustration in my state with a lot of people, and we're a very generally conservative political base here as well, and but that's where the things like 15 days to slow the spread, or 2 weeks to crush the curve, or 1 month to, and so there's, with all the mandates, it seems like every chapter that goes by, it's like, hey, we can be in a much better position in 3 weeks if we will just do this, very carefully. And 3 weeks has been dozens now of iterations of those 2 or 3 week statements. And so it's interesting, because at first you say a whole year, and you're like, that's crazy, that's abhorrent. But then from your point of view, it's like, well, at least that's what we can buckle up for. And if it's better, it's better. If it only takes 6 months, great. If it only takes 3 months, great.
Sue,
I think
no,
yeah, no, go ahead, David.
could you put yourself into go into the Sue of the past in February 2020, and if they had told you then, masks
Mm-hmm.
every day, all in every store, every indoor space for a year, would you have the same mind, do you think? Or yeah?
I masks for me happened immediately when they started talking about it. Maybe I'll preface this with a little bit of extra information about me that very personally impacts why I think about it the way I do. One, my second job that I do, I work as a massage therapist. So I am very much in people's personal space. When I'm working on a client, there's no 6 feet from them. There's lots of the time, 6 or 12 inches between their face and mine. So aside from COVID-19, there were lots of times and lots of clients as a student that I would have rather they had a mask on so I didn't have to breathe their breath anyway. So, there's that piece of the puzzle. And the second piece is that I am really conscious of the risk factor for myself personally, because I had a heart attack not quite 2 years ago. And so the idea of catching something that could potentially have long-term effects on my cardiovascular system is very intimidating to me. And so I uptook very quickly when it came to mask wearing. I haven't been out of my house anywhere in the public at all without a mask since initial lockdown here. So,
And is it your position that other citizens ought to do the same for your safety?
I appreciate the people who will do it for my safety and for other people's safety, because it isn't just me. And there are lots of people who you can't tell by looking at us, who are in those higher risk categories. There's people who are in those higher risk categories who don't know that, right? There's people with undiagnosed diabetes and things like that who don't know that they're at a higher risk. And so to me, it seems like a fairly minor inconvenience and discomfort, especially in most public places. What we're doing for activities in most of those places are not that heavily impinged by having to wear a mask. When I go shopping for a few groceries, it isn't that disruptive for me to have a mask on. It's a lot more disruptive to try to do massage with a mask on, or to try to, do certain kinds of jobs that other people hold and things while you're having a mask. And if those people can do it, I'm sort of the mind that it's not that hard for me to throw one on when I go to the grocery store when I need to.
Can I ask too, because you said earlier, if your government decides 6 months from now that there's no need, that they'll turn and maybe repeal the law. Has it been your experience that governments repeal controls once they have those controls in place?
No, but I think what we do often see is that they
I know
just
I'm
stop
asking a rhetorical question there, but sorry to interrupt.
But like I said, I think the big thing is they stop enforcing, right? I mean, I don't know. You're in Ontario, maybe you don't have all the same horse-related old bylaws and things like we do in Edmonton. But if I go and hitch my horse up in front of the local business, and they don't have a hitching post for me, that's still an illegal thing here. But I'm pretty sure there's no cop going to actually give them a ticket for not having a hitching post out front, even though it's a law on the books.
Yeah, that raises an issue around the arbitrary nature of enforcement. So, like, this might be a tangent here, Steve, but I'm of the opinion that if there is a law, it ought to be enforced as written, rather than having a law enforcement entity like the police who can arbitrarily enforce it. On a whim. Today they can enforce it, tomorrow they decide not to. That's a very dangerous setting, and I think I disagree with your assertion that maybe 6 months from now they'll just stop enforcing it as much, and whereas I would rather that they enforce it as written, and then when citizens get fed up with it, they repeal the law completely. And when everyone wakes up to the fact that the data quite clearly indicate that there's a very small risk group who we ought to protect, and they are quite vulnerable, and people with specific conditions are vulnerable, and the rest seem to be quite resilient to this. And I heard the other day up to 40% don't even show symptoms or feel illness.
And I don't disagree with you, David. I mean, my preference, if the world could work in a smooth and effective way, I agree with you. I would rather see that we have laws that are in place and are enforced effectively as written, and when they're no longer needed, are removed. But, frankly, government is not really that effective in how they work. And I mean, there's, hundreds of years of countries that have shown that there's lots of laws that just gather dust on the books and sit there, unfortunately.
So let me take this in a little bit of a different direction, because I've thought a lot about this. Probably everybody's thought a lot about it in the last little while, but my my sense is if the government and the medical community, which they're communicating a lot already, obviously, but if they were to come out and very clearly lay out the best data that they have, which is going to conflict, it's going to change, it's going to, evolve as the disease evolves, as the numbers change, all of those things are going to change. But if they were very clear and transparent, as honest as they could be about here's what we're dealing with, here's what we think will help, and masks included, we think they'll help. Um, my sense is there's some portion of the population that would generally agree with that. And my guess is that that's somewhere over half. So call it 60% who would say, you know what, the president has suggested it, the prime minister has suggested it. I've heard lots of medical people who seem to think that's a good idea, and I'm just going to try and do my part, and I feel like I'm going to encourage my family to wear masks when we go out to the store. And and then there's going to be 40% who will take a little bit of convincing, and there'll be a spectrum of, some people at the one end of the spectrum who are like, well, you can't make me do anything I don't want to do, and so I'm, everybody else's health be damned or whatever. I don't care. I'm going to do what I do. But then there's going to be a spectrum of all the way down to give me a little bit of data, a little bit more understanding. If I see the trends go a certain way in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to hop on board too and be doing that because I feel like that's an important part of my responsibility as a citizen. By mandating, my feeling is they take that 60% who would comply pretty quickly and easily anyway, and they're now cemented in that camp. Like, well, we would have done it anyway. We don't see why the other 40% won't get on board. It seems ridiculous to us. But then rather than having a spectrum among that other 40%, you now create a polarization because I feel like personally I'm probably somewhere about halfway through that spectrum. I feel like it's important to have some kind of dissent about masks. I feel like there are some pretty significant social consequences. It's not difficult. It's not hard to throw the mask on, and go to the store, but there is, and maybe I'm biased, and maybe it's a confirmation bias for me. I feel like there's so much less eye contact, less courtesy, more like not only am I supposed to wear the mask, but I'm supposed to be 6 feet away. So you know what, just to be safe, maybe I just won't look at anybody, and I feel like it's a less comfortable thing. And I feel like there is although wearing the mask physically for a few minutes has almost zero consequence on your trip to the store, the cumulative consequence of that, I think, could be significant over the course of months or years. We've got, kindergartners now who have known nothing else. They don't know what their teachers look like except through a mask, and they don't know going to school. And so if this goes on for a year, like in Edmonton, if it goes on 2 years, all of a sudden we're going to have people that are very uncomfortable not wearing a mask. And you may say, well, that's going to have a lot less flu, and that's great, but there's some social consequence to that, in my opinion. But I guess to get back to my point is, I now, with the mandates, I'm like, I'm going to step over and be one of those dissenters as much as I can. Where I'm forced to, I guess I'll comply. But I'm because I feel like it's just necessary to have dissent for the sake of dissent, so that, because if 100% turn into compliant, the government has no fetters really on what they can do. And I feel like a lot of the governors and a lot of the premiers just listening to some of the things going on in Manitoba, especially, it's like they feel like they're marionette puppeteers, and there's strings and levers that they can pull in society and say, let's pull this lever and see what the consequences are on the numbers. And it's not great science, and it's I think it's overreach. I'm sorry,
Sue,
maybe I've talked too much.
Sue, I know you want to jump in here. I just want to add one thing here. Edmonton Council has demonstrated that this isn't about the science at all. Okay? A year of mask laws, and they don't have a crystal ball. It means they're going to ignore the science, no matter what it is, for the year. And I think you're exactly right that those 40% that would have been a spectrum, there would have been 2 or 3%, principally against the issue, and they would have stood their ground. You can't make me wear the mask. And there would have been 37% of us that would have said, well, if I'm going to be in an environment with the elderly, I'll wear a mask. If I'm going to, be out with my kids at the park and not wear a mask. The Edmonton City Council has made a statement here, a political statement, that is not science-based at all. Over to you, Sue.
Well, I actually agree with you guys on that quite fully, that at the core of it, we should be listening to the science, and we should be listening to the doctors. And I think it really has been an issue across a lot of places that these issues have become politicized and polarized because of that, rather than just being able to acknowledge and go, the best indications from science right now say masks work. So we should all do this because it works and it's better for everybody. And we'll do it for as long as we need to, as long as the science supports that. Because that isn't how the conversations have happened, because that isn't, at least from my standpoint, from what I see here, and certainly what I've seen in a lot of ways out of the States, is that it is a political voice telling us what we should and shouldn't be doing with it, not a medical, not a science voice that's telling us, even when it actually is, in our case, Dr. Henshaw here in Alberta, you can sort of hear that tone of, this isn't what I'm telling you to do because medical science supports it. It's what I'm telling you to do because it's what, has been agreed politically that we should do. And I agree. I don't think that's grand. I think that is a poor way for us to be making the decisions. I don't know what the right way to get around that is. I don't know how we get the decision making in the right hands. I don't know how we fix that, but I agree with you guys on that.
Well, okay, so that actually sounds like a contradiction here. You're on one hand saying, I'm content with the 1 year, I'll do it, I'm on board. On the other hand, you just said you'd rather they speak from a place of, let's say science-based or fact-based decision making, but you can hear it in Dr. Henry's voice that that's not what's going on. You'd rather it be get the decisions in the right hands.
I think
My opinion is that the individual.
I think it's because I am in that, as Steve sort of, we've kind of determined, like 60%. I will wear a mask as long as there's any reasonable evidence that says it's not going to hurt me. That's where I stand on it. I don't have any issue with doing it. I don't find that I'm struggling with it socially because of it. Like for me personally, there is not a significant downside to my wearing it. This is why I don't personally take issue. Mandate it as long as you want to mandate it. It's not going to really make a difference on how I behave personally.
Okay.
That's why I have an issue with it. Doesn't mean I agree that they are making it in the right ways or for the right reasons.
Let me share a personal perspective that counters yours there. I have 2 children. Both of them are very young, kindergarten and grade 3. The provincial government said children grade 4 and higher ought to wear masks in the classroom and throughout the schools, but younger, don't make them do it. If they're willing, it can't hurt. Maybe there's some benefit there, but it can do harm. There's a psychological effect. We have to watch out from mental well-being of these very young kids. They're not able to manage it effectively. It's going to get dirty. They're going to, drop it. They're going to, and so on. Let's not make them wear the masks. And then in the city of London, the school districts here, that the trustees on the school boards made motions to then enforce masks all the way down to kindergarten. So I do have two children that have been in school now since September, and they've never seen their teachers' faces. They've never seen a smile from a grown-up in the school. They even outside are having to wear masks sometimes. Like they've been told, for example, if you're going to play tag it requires close contact, so you're going to have to put the mask on if you're going to play tag outside. And so, well, now there's restrictions on these games that they can play or not. It's all very confusing, when in fact the law of the province is still that they don't have to wear it. It is in fact their choice. The school board admits it's not enforceable, and yet teachers, principals, all the way up to the superintendent are enforcing it as though it's enforceable. The kids aren't given an option to take it off. And it angers me, because this is clear government overreach. It's not science-based at all. It's a few activists as trustees going beyond what even, let's think about it. The province decided to recommend masks for grade 4 and higher. They were over-engineering their advice to begin with, right? They're taking a err on the side of caution stance to begin with, and then the trustees go ahead and do this even further. So we know from great data that children are absolutely not at risk of this. They aren't spreading it wildly. A few schools have a couple of, in Ontario, an outbreak is one case in a school, right? One case that might be symptomatic, or it might be flu symptoms for that matter, and before even getting the test results, it's announced as a case and an outbreak before the child even has test results back. So it's dishonest reporting leading to dishonest policy making. I'm upset about it. I'd rather my children have a normal experience in the classroom. There's no reason it couldn't be normal tomorrow. And so I am upset with, let's say, because that 60% we're talking about is also a spectrum where, there's 15% of you that you're appreciative of the policies, you're going to go ahead and comply. But there's a good portion of those folks who are adamant and militant that that everyone ought to, and there should be no choice, and it should be enforced with massive fines.
And I agree that this is unfortunately, again, very much born of it being a political conversation instead of a medical conversation. If we were, instead of putting the money into arguing about it and mandating it and enforcing it and all of those pieces of the puzzle, if we were ensuring that we were putting out good, cohesive, concise information that was based off of the medical data, and making it very clear to people that changes. I mean, science changes. It's not, we've determined that this is what it is and this will forever be the case. I mean, there's not a lot of scientific data, even from, the good old days of the beginning of science, that hasn't changed or adjusted. So we need to teach people that that's the truth of it, that the best knowledge, the best data and information that we have today says this is where we are. And next week, that will change. We don't know how it will change, but it will change. And we will still present you with the best data and the best information and have people make the best decisions based on that. But because that's not what's happening, we end up in exactly the dynamics you're talking about, where there's people who have decided that out of, mitigating the risk, we should make all children wear masks. I don't agree. I agree with you in that. I think there is risks for children. I think there is damage that will come from that psychologically for them. I think that children should be able to see faces. I also think there's a normal amount of germs that children need to get to develop a healthy immune system. This is probably not one that they need to do that with, but who knows? Maybe it is. We don't have the science to tell us one way or the other yet. Um, Again, just because I think that something is right for me and I'm agreeable and amenable to it does not mean that I think that that is true for everyone. But I do agree with you. There are people who become militant. But what in our society doesn't have that? I don't think there's a subject that you won't find militant, very polarized, extensive ends to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me draw back to the idea of fundamental freedoms. Um, well, two things I'd like to express. One is just an aside. Science has become such an incredible buzzword in the last, I don't know, 4 months or something. It's kind of taken on a meaning of its own. The one thing that bothers me is science doesn't seem to include the science of economics or the science of statistics. And I feel like that's like the medical science is important, epidemiological science is important, but statistical science and economic science is important too. Statistics being, managing that data, trying to understand and constantly shift out and higher to gain perspective on the data, and to help things to be expressed. Are we mixing our metaphors? Are we talking percentages on one hand and real numbers on the other hand? Or are we talking a month timeline here and a week timeline here? And I see such an abysmal job in the media and just generally of like graphs. Like, I'm not a statistical scientist or mathematician by any means, and even if with my layperson's perspective, I can see like that doesn't make sense. You're comparing apples and oranges here. And then economics, I think people make the mistake of feeling like economics is just a discipline where you talk about how Jeff Bezos can make more money, or you talk about how to feed poor children in Africa. And it's not so much about money as it is about motivation. Economics is really the study of motivations that people have, and how you create, how incentivization in large groups of people works. If you do this, how do people act, in aggregate? And I think with mask mandates, with a pervasive flu symptoms that are going around, with a COVID germ in the air. I mean, the idea of how does incentives work in society is incredibly important and terribly overlooked, as we talk about this subject. But that aside, when you talk about the 60%, if that's the number, the United States Constitution was specifically designed to protect, in most cases, in all cases, I would say, the 40%, meaning that what we're going to have here is absolutely not a democracy, because democratically, the 60% are always going to get they're going to get what they want. They're going to, those kinds of social changes or political changes will happen as a natural consequence of that being the majority opinion. But what we're going to do is create a constitution that protects certain freedoms of the minority, especially. So when there's 80% of the people feel like this is what needs to happen, there's going to be specific protections for that 20% that's left over. And I would say, keeping my store open, being able to do commerce the way that I feel, wearing a mask or not, assembling with people, whether that's in my home with families or going to a concert or whatever, those are some of the basic freedoms that were written into the American Constitution and in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. Those are freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, including what you wear, etc. And we're picking away at those, and it's and I've been somewhat shocked in the last 8 months as to how easy apparently it is to pick away if we feel like there's a good enough reason. And people's lives is a pretty compelling reason, certainly. But anyway, sorry, soapbox.
Sue, do you want to go there?
Yeah.
Actually, you know what I think is really interesting about this is that I think we have really exemplified why face-to-face, whether through technology or otherwise, communication is not conducive to running down the rabbit hole of the social media conversation. Because obviously there's a significant diversity in our opinions and the way that we all perceive these circumstances that we've been talking about. And yet we've been able to have a completely rational and respectful conversation about it. Whereas if Steve had posted an anti-mask meme and I had made a comment on it, you know, there's a really good chance that would have gone down a pretty rotten rabbit hole pretty fast. And so I think it really exemplifies where we sort of started this conversation off, and the value in being able to look beyond the meme, look beyond the soundbite, and actually listen to the other person and actually hear why they think what they think, and understand that it's a spectrum most of the time, and it's not that very polarized statement or conclusion that we draw from a statement that somebody else posted. So I think it's really interesting to see that in action.
The medium does matter.
Yeah, very much so.
I have
and
a
that I think
thought here. Go ahead,
impact
Sue.
in that, and paying attention to that when you participate in it. You know, even if that's as simple as, you know, when you post the meme, put an opening sentence on it for yourself. Don't just hit, you know, share. Actually write something that sort of talks about why you see it the way you see it. When you're responding to them, be willing to have real conversation in the response, not just a snapback comment, right? Be willing to send the Facebook message to actually have a real conversation with the person once you've started it that way.
Yeah, I have found Facebook a little better than Twitter. Twitter being limited to such short formats, it can easily escalate into divisive conversation. Facebook, at least you can do long form sometimes, but it's hardly a solution. I'm going to presume that both of you aren't in a hurry and that we could continue for a while, because there's a question here. I thought, Sue, I'd like to get your thoughts around this, and it kind of picks up on what Steve was saying here around fundamental freedoms. So, Sue, last week we spoke with Kimberly Newdorf, who's kind of local in my area and very active as a mom and as a liberty buff, she calls herself. And she reminded me in our conversation, you know, I was reminded that back in February and March, when the data published worldwide was that this thing had a 3.6 or 3.8% fatality rate, and it was spreading quickly and so forth. We had business owners voluntarily shut down their business, hair salons and massage therapists and so forth. They voluntarily shut down. Restaurants voluntarily closed. Airlines voluntarily stopped selling flights for certain routes, like out of Wuhan, China. I bought masks. You know, that would seem to be logical, even though our Canadian health authorities were not yet advising it. So we did see individuals take action, and in light of that data, it seems to me then that as the data evolved, and for example, the CDC published that their best estimates is that for people, and I'm going to get the stats just wrong from memory, but I'm in the ballpark here, that if you're younger than 45 years old, even if you contract this thing, your chance of death is like 1 in 300,000. In Canada, out of 10,800 deaths, so far, something like 10,500 of those have been in long-term care facilities. 80% of those have been patients with dementia or other major comorbidities. So we're talking about, those are tragic, but we're also talking about 300 deaths throughout the entire country among, people 60 or younger, relatively healthy. And people, I think individuals, are responding to that and saying, well, based on the data, the risks are much lower than we thought in February and March, and so I'm going to go about my life mostly as normal. And what are these politicians doing? And so we're seeing businesses stay open in Etobicoke today in protest of the recent law passed by Doug Ford. And we're seeing people stand up against these governments that are overreaching and imposing these decisions that aren't very fact-based. My question, Sue, you said earlier, how do we get decisions to be made by the right people? And I do think that the right people are the individual citizen on an individual basis, given good data.
And I don't just.
But if you don't disagree with that, I don't know how to reconcile your earlier statements that you're absolutely in favor of the Edmonton Council saying a year of masks.
I would caution that statement. It's not that I'm absolutely in support of Edmonton Council making that decision. It's that I personally am not bothered by it. And so because I'm not bothered by it, I kind of am like, whatever. Which is sort of that, it's not the best community attitude. I'll acknowledge that. That's not me really thinking about everybody involved. But I don't really know where to go with that, or how to explain, how to bring them into alignment at a place that makes sense, because I just don't think that often, I don't think the government, when they're making these decisions, are making them solely based on the same kind of motivations that I personally would be making my decisions on. And I probably don't have a broad enough spectrum to understand, or a broad enough knowledge base to understand necessarily why they're making. I'm also not a statistical scientist. I'm not an economic scientist. I don't know all of the impacts. I don't know all of the ins and outs. But I do know that for me personally, if wearing masks saves lives, that is, for me personally, the line in the sand that makes sense. I don't see issues around putting that law in place and hopefully saving lives.
And so you're sufficiently convinced that people's lives are in fact at risk?
I do, yeah. I think that even if we're just talking about seniors who will die sooner than they might otherwise have. That's still a risk. I think there's also the fact that we don't know what the long-term consequences to having this is, because
Or
we haven't
benefits.
to having had COVID. Sorry, is what I mean.
No,
Like,
no, I mean, there might actually be benefits to contracting it. There's at least there's at least one doctor that comes to mind that I follow at Twitter. She's a well-known doctor in Ontario. I forget she's an executive director of a group. I forget her, Ontario Doctors something or other. Talking about the fact that the people who seem to recover quite rapidly from COVID-19 have tended to be the people that have had severe coronavirus infections in the past. And so,
Okay.
I mean, I don't know the science here, but there's something about T cells and T cell immunities that,
So I would say so a level of immunity based on having had. Sorry, are you like, is it suggesting that like other variations of coronavirus?
yeah, like, so for example,
Oh,
if someone survived SARS,
okay.
COVID is a walk in the park.
They are more likely to which is very possible.
Right. And
Again,
so
I
if I, and I might be speaking with, I am speaking as a naive layman in this point, but based on the little
as are
I
many of
understand her publications and the research papers that she points to and links to, it might be true that if I contract COVID now and recover from it, then when the next massive disruptive coronavirus is evolved out of nothingness in the world, my body is that much better prepared for it. And
yeah.
so, anyway, I didn't mean to go on a tangent there.
I think it's a valid point, though. I mean, we don't know, and
Yeah, my point only is that everyone so far seems to be of the opinion that there's only cons.
true, and I think
yeah,
I think that's an interesting piece of that polarized conversation that happens around it. I mean, personally, I would rather not ever break my leg in order to have it heal stronger and never, know that that spot that broke will never break again. I would rather just avoid ever breaking my leg. But, the truth of the matter is that's how the human body works. If I break my leg, that spot will heal in such a fashion that that particular spot will probably never break again. You balance that in how do I feel about having broken my leg and gone through the process of healing that and the pain and discomfort and challenges and everything else that came along with the broken leg. I personally am more inclined to try to avoid getting sick. I would like not to get COVID-19 in hopes that that will help me be healthier the next time something comes around, because I don't want to go through, A, potentially dying, B, all of the other things that could happen to me in the healing process.
well, let's be
right?
clear. I'm not going to go seek the virus and make sure I
No.
get infected. I'm just saying that in the risk calculation, I have to think, how much do I need to or want to fundamentally alter my life and my family's life and the life of my community in order to mitigate the risk of getting a virus that it seems 99.9997% of people survive with ease.
And that's a fair assessment. I mean, that's, at the end of the day, that's why I think we do need to have better medical science information presented, and to have that less tainted by either the economics or the political statements around it. Because if people actually had good, solid medical scientific information, we could probably make those decisions from a healthier, more intelligent place rather than from a fear-based place. You know,
I might argue we do have that data available, that there are plenty of sources of such research. You know, the CDC, for example, and Canada's own statistics, and various others, but we're not able to exercise those decisions because those decisions have been outsourced to a government body that I no longer can influence. I mean, not even my vote seems to have had an influence there, and it won't until another 3 years when the election comes around again. So my choices have been stripped from me.
But how is that different from any other time that our governments are making decisions?
It isn't, which is why we should have governments making as little decision as possible about the realm of the individual and the realm of the family.
And I don't disagree.
So let me put another spin on this. A lot of people have used the analogy of speed limits. If we just reduced the speed limits everywhere to, I'll translate this, 20 kilometers per hour everywhere, highways included, there would be a demonstrable savings in lives. And if the idea is, if 10 million people wear a mask and even one life is saved, isn't that worth the inconvenience, such as it might be for those 10 million people? If a single life is saved, what's a life worth? It's infinite, right? The analogy I prefer is 9/11, and so that was a huge watershed time in the United States, all over the world in some ways, but 3,000 lives snuffed out on 9/11, that Tuesday morning 20 years or so ago. And one of the consequences, there's a lot of consequences and a lot of changes, but one, if you just take one for context, we now take our shoes off at the airport, right? We empty our bags, can't take more than a certain amount of liquid, et cetera. But even just, let's isolate that even further. Just taking your shoes off, going through the security, and putting your shoes back on. That's, and then the line that's created as a consequence of that, obviously, in some airports, that's a lot worse than others. But say you aggregate that across everybody that's ever gone on an airline, and some people waiting 2 hours and some people getting through relatively quickly, and call it 15 minutes. And there being, in North America, probably in the order of 75 million airline trips per year, and multiply that by 15 minutes, multiply that by 20 years, and you end up with this scale. And I think a lot of people hesitate to do that math because on one hand you have lives, and how do you measure that? But one measurement would be to say 3,000 people lost their lives. The average age of those people is probably in the order of 35 or 40 years old. And so 3,000 times 40 years of life that they should have had that they were robbed of that day is 120,000 years of life.
Steve.
If you take 1 billion airline trips times 15 minutes, the scale, I mean, that 120,000 years or whatever of life, it tips. It's so much worse. And as we look back on the last 20 years, that's mostly security theater. Like I don't know that there's been one provable, demonstrable case of putting everybody through that process has ever dissuaded or diffused a situation like 9/11. I'm not sure that there's been a single case. I mean, I know there's been knives found and certain things found, but as far as was there a terrorist plot, most of the terrorist plots get stopped before that in planning stages or whatever because the NSA is spying on us like crazy or whatever. And so maybe that's another one of those equivocations. But and that's economics to me, and that's statistics to me. Is there's I don't know if it was my own daughter's or my own wife's life, then obviously to me that's immeasurable, and so should it be and would be for anybody else. But as government policies and as societal, as we look to balance the consequences and perceived values of overarching things that affect all of us, I just think that math has to be done in some form or another. And so that, like, to David's point, having the information and what you said, Sue, having the information in the first place, but there has to be a willingness to look at that with, and I don't know, maybe you disagree. Maybe you feel like that's a Machiavellian, Ebenezer Scrooge way of looking at the world. I don't know.
No, I was actually going to say, I think that if you want to talk about doing the math, you got to make sure we do the right math, though, because taking off your shoes and dealing with all that stuff's not actually born out of 9/11 anyway. It was born out of one idiot building a bomb in his shoe who was stopped before he ever got on the plane anyway. So nobody died. And we all take our shoes off. So
right.
There's a different set of math there, I think. And I think the comparison for me, again, I don't disagree with there needs to be the math done. I guess what I look at is, I agree with you. I don't think that taking off your shoes and jumping a lot of those hoops has actually done anybody any good. I don't think it has been anything other than a show. And, we had a kid flew out of Edmonton with basically a pipe bomb that he'd made for a school assignment, science thing or whatever, flew out of the Edmonton airport with it in his bag because they didn't catch it. And I think it was when he flew home or something, but please don't quote me on the story, but there was something along those lines. I agree with you. I don't see the value in it. But when it comes to mask wearing, there is evidence that wearing masks does reduce the risk for people. And so I don't feel like it's an apples to apples, but then I guess that's where the opinions start to come into play, right? What one person perceives as being important because it does lower the risk, another person may say, but do we really need to lower the risk? Is this really that big of a deal to lower the risk? And I don't know how we bring that together.
Well, I propose we could bring it together like this. And by Steve's story, it occurred to me actually that the fallout of 9/11 for me, that the part that bothers me actually has nothing to do with safety or security and lives. It has to do with the fact that after 9/11, that government used that opportunity to impose massive worldwide surveillance, and they've never repealed those controls. So the Patriot Act went into play, and I know, even as a Canadian citizen, that when I pick up my phone and talk to it or talk to somebody, I know that someone in the NSA or some other agency is listening in or could listen in, that it's being recorded. And that's the problem I see that's happening now. So, Sue, it's actually my opinion that given good data, individuals will make the right choice most of the time. Most individuals would make the right choice most of the time. We wouldn't get rid of, we're not going to go to COVID zero, because that's not possible under any circumstance, but we would, people would put a mask on if they're in proximity with elderly people, or they would put a mask on in maybe the grocery store willingly, and so forth. And otherwise, they'd exercise their individual choices. The trouble I'm having here is government overreach. That people have so willingly outsourced their decisions to politicians who truly are looking to get reelected, and so they're taking the path of let's say, they're erring on the side of political opinion. And if the 60% want masks, they're going to go with that political opinion despite the science. And as citizens, we're going to maybe never get back the ground we've lost to the politicians in this period. So the Edmonton City Council, tell me when they're going to give up the level of control they currently have, because they may not. It might have to be taken back through election or whatever.
I think the challenge that comes from that, though, is in order to change the way that those decisions get made politically, we need to engage the populace in a way that we have a subject that the whole populace cares enough about to engage. Because what is a hot button topic to me may not matter to you. We're in very different places in our world. You have small children, I have a grown child. I have a child with learning disabilities. I'm a single income family. We have very different perceptions of the world and what is important and what's worth going to the mat for on a political front and what's not. And unfortunately, I think that is at the real core of it. I think that's where politics works for them. They're really good at keeping us divided. They do a really great job of keeping us nose down and focused on getting by on a day-to-day basis in many ways, so that we don't have the energy to stand up as a group and say, we're not okay with what you're doing.
That's the healthy skepticism of government I was hoping to hear earlier about the year-long mask rule in Edmonton. Because I do have a healthy skepticism of government now, and I think that I've changed in recent years. I didn't used to fear government control the way I do now. And I think a healthy level of fear some level of fear is healthy, so that the populace can continually put friction on those boundaries where government tries to overreach.
I think you'd find that in the majority of people. I think it's that you have to find the particular subject that hits that button for them, right? So for me, it's not masks. I'm not that particular subject isn't my button, but there's plenty of them that are.
Let me posit this. So you've got individuals, and we all make our decisions, right? And we say, I've got a certain amount of influence, and there's a sphere in which that influence has potency, right? The things that I can affect and control to whatever extent. And I can do that on my own behalf. I can do it, in my family, in my neighborhood, perhaps. Now I become an elected official. And so a lot of like-minded people or similar-minded people elect me and send me to a governmental body to then represent them. And somehow I feel like it's become popular for me to make this shift as I take off my citizen cloak and put on my government suit or whatever. All of a sudden, my thinking shifts from what can I do as an individual to now I have influence. I don't have absolute influence, but I have a little bit of influence over a lot of people. And to the point, I can put some legislation into place, and I can create incentives or disincentives, and I can try and push people to make a good decision that will cumulatively have a good effect on all of them. And I have great intentions. I think most people have good intentions. I think there's very few purely evil, Hitler-esque people out there with simply bad intentions. who just want to go and hurt people or wreck things. Generally, I don't think that's most people's motivation. But when I get there to government and I say, wait a minute, now I don't have to settle for what I can directly influence or the little bit of influence I have in my small sphere. I now have this huge sphere. And boy, do I now have a responsibility? Like, if I simply push out a mask mandate, or if I can convince, 60% of the population or 80% of the population to do A, B, or C, I could actually move the needle. I could actually fix things. I could actually, wow, oh, wow, I'm going to get together a group of people behind me. We're going to get a consensus with the other lawmakers, and we are going to get something done. And we are going to actually make a difference. We are actually going to fix things. And you get intoxicated with that idea of fixing things, right? When the reality is, at least in our Constitution, the way that our government was founded, and if you read the Founding Fathers' words and the Federalist Papers and lots of other things by Washington, et cetera, it's all about what can we do to provide a system that will constantly snuff out that tendency for people to start trying to fix things, and that will keep constantly reminding them that the only reason that they're there and the only job that they have is to remember the small amount of influence they had individually and to protect hundreds or thousands or millions of people's rights in that way. Like, I'm going to come here for a time and babysit or monitor the government and make sure that, especially my constituents, that their individual rights to continue to live the way that they feel is appropriate is protected. And in as much as situations happen that force some kind of legislation or whatever, I'm going to make sure that their individual interests are protected so that they continue to have the right and the ability and the freedom, the liberty to exercise that liberty. And I think, because I mean, that's a basic conservative tenet, I suppose, is the idea that human beings, when they get together in groups and try to fix things, generally, through unintended consequences, end up making a mess of it. They wreck more than they fix. They take one step forward and three steps back, and sometimes the three steps back don't materialize or manifest for 10 or 20 years, but eventually they do. Like Social Security was this panacea back when FDR introduced it, and it is now the Achilles heel of the American economy. No politician wants to discuss it. No economist really has a super good idea of how to fix it, and there's no fixing it without potentially affecting millions and hundreds of millions of people, and yet it's destroying us. So as a short term is a step forward, and ever since then it's been steps backwards, and it continues to cause problems. And so again, it's that idea of, I'm in government and therefore I have these levers. I can force people to do X, Y, or Z, and that's going to fix things or make things better. And it just doesn't.
I think you're not wrong about
Wow.
that. I think there's something else going on too. I believe when someone is elected into a public office, it's also very simple math. They consider, how can I keep this salary beyond my 4-year term? Or how do I keep this influence beyond my 4-year term? Or how do I keep this office? So whatever their motivations were to achieve that office, they want to hold it. And they forget that they weren't just elected by those like-minded folks. They were elected in a constituency, and ought to represent all the constituents and the spectrum of values and opinions within that constituency, but yet they get into that office and they think, the way for me to hold on to this, and I'm being cynical about this, and I think that's the appropriate level of analysis here. How can I keep this position? Well, I have to weigh public opinion effectively and respond accordingly. So the fixing things might actually be a secondary motive, or it might be that's what that's the luxury a politician can afford when they can have a relatively secure seat, and until the seat is secure, actually what they're doing is they're chasing the security of their own office, re-election.
But still, for ostensibly good intentions, it's like I have a vision of what I'm going to fix, and it's going to take me not 4 years, but 8 or 12 years. And so part of me fulfilling my responsibility to the world and fixing this problem is making sure that I'm here for the next whatever, to be able to continue to exert that influence and to make sure that things go the right way. And I'm watching in our country, it used to be, boy, these liberals are just becoming such activist politicians and trying to push this agenda and change things. And the Republicans, the conservative side of the political spectrum in government, are becoming just as activist. And so it goes conservative to liberal to conservative to liberal, theoretically,
Policy
but all that's
lurch.
really happening is the legislation just keeps piling up, and the rules and the complexity of doing anything keeps piling up, and the real consequence of that is the erosion of your individual ability to do things as you see fit for you and your family.
Point of order. I think we've changed subjects to
Yes.
some degree, and we've
I
been
also
we've
wanted
been
to
at
point
it
out
for a
that
while. Yeah, go ahead, Sue.
we made it an hour and a half before Hitler came into the conversation, so I figured we did pretty good.
Yeah, and it was Steve.
I think we
brought that
proved
up.
our original point.
Yeah.
This has been a really great and productive conversation. My takeaway from this is, that's wonderful. Now, so what? Even for me, I think I would have a hard time sitting through this conversation again to watch it. And so and maybe this is just catharsis for ourselves and our viewers. I won't betray how many viewers we actually have, but there's a huge preponderance of Sue and I's mother, I believe, represented in the demographic of our viewership.
Sounds like a reasonable thing. And she's probably thrilled to watch you and I sit and have a calm, rational conversation with each other, that she didn't have to try to.
Yes. Can I jump in here? Because so I've when you introduced yourself earlier, Sue, I was thinking of a problem I've observed in our family, and that is, I live in sort of central eastern Canada. Most of my family lives in western Canada. We get together summers, maybe Christmas seasons, and we literally have a few hours together, or maybe a couple of days, which really isn't enough time to get into a conversation and talk. And so what used to happen is that my sister and I, or my brother and I, because they're sort of one side and I was on the other, we would clash and then argue and not have enough time to let that resolve. Okay, so like in music, there's dissonance and then there has to be consonance, and that shift is what's really important in music. We would have dissonance with no opportunity for consonance. I expect that you would experience that with Steve, being that you live apart, or that you would have interactions online only, and hopefully this kind of conversation in this format is better, easier.
Well, I think it took a really conscious effort for us to find a place where we could have that consonance. because, yeah, we probably, certainly as much, if not more so, don't see each other face to face often. We can go years before we're in the same room together, and then that may only be for a handful of hours when we are in the same room. And it's usually in the midst of all of the chaos of the larger family. So yeah, there's very minimal time, which I guess has an advantage in that it's rare that we would have a big clash in that face-to-face environment. And I don't know if that's just a product of everybody sort of puts the polite face on because we're all there together and we all know it for a very limited time. Or probably more accurately from my side of the table was the sense of being in the minority of most of those clashes and not wanting to engage in them in a way that would feel like it's me against the family. I'd rather be able to just be there and participate. I think the real downside that comes from that in the family unit is that I don't feel like I have necessarily shown my genuine self to the family in a lot of ways because I don't talk about those things. I avoid the conversation. I smile and nod and sit quietly in the corner. And I don't think that's necessarily the most productive way to be with your family. But it takes a really conscious effort to evolve away from that. Steve and I, at some point, probably in that 3, 4, 5, 6 month range of this, when we were finding that we were clashing online and we were butting heads, and my automatic response was to fall right back into that territory of just saying, I'm simply not going to participate in this conversation with you. It's not okay for me to be there. I don't want this level of myself peeled open to the world, even just on my Facebook. And so I'm just not going to do it. And it was Steve reaching out and saying, let's get together once a week and have a Facebook Messenger phone call and talk about stuff that let me peel back the layers that felt safe to be vulnerable to my brother in this case, and share things with him and talk about them and learn about his opinions and let him learn about my opinions. And I think that is extra vital when you only get that very limited time with your family, when you're so far apart physically, and when the time that you do get to spend together is pressurized. I think we have to make that extra effort if we want to have a genuine relationship.
I think you've summed it up nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope Mom's proud of us, if that's who indeed is
Mom,
watching.
we're going to let you go to sleep now. I think I think we've reached the end of our conversation here tonight.
So,
well, I thank you, gentlemen, both. I really appreciated getting to be here and participate in divergent opinions on a whole bunch of topics.
it's been really nice to talk with you again, even after all these years. Part of me is trying to remember, Sue as a younger girl, and maybe when we do this in future, Steve, what we should do is find a yearbook and have an old photo. But anyway, Sue, again, nice to see you.
Yes, lovely, gentlemen. Have a wonderful evening. Both.
Okay, so how this works, by the way, Sue, is we're going to take you off screen, and then you're welcome to exit or mute. But just remember that once you're off screen, you may still be heard if you're going to talk to yourself or others.
You hear me yelling at my cats, so
Yeah,
I'll probably mute so you don't hear that. So.
All right. Well, have a great night.
All right. Good night.
Steve, it's been nice to talk with your sister. Again, I actually don't remember the last time I would have seen her, but and I didn't know that she's now in Edmonton. That's good to hear. Let's debrief.
Well, I think this. I mean, it'll be interesting. Monday we'll be chatting with Brian Hyde, and I think it'll be a little bit of an extension of this conversation. What's the role of podcasts like this? Again, I've had several people as we've begun to do this, and some good friends and acquaintances give me some feedback. A lot of the feedback has been, it's not very entertaining. Maybe if you would stir things up a little bit more, or argue a little more, or keep it pithy, maybe sound bites, you could edit it down somehow. And from the beginning, that's been our kind of our line in the sand is uninterrupted, unedited, unscripted, natural. It's natural conversation.
It's not quite natural in the sense that, if we were seeing each other weekly for the past few years, and this was happening over glasses of beer, or whatever it is whatever you partake in, if it's tea or I actually don't know. Do you drink beer? Hold on, I've lost you. I've lost your audio. Yeah, we've lost your audio, Steve. Batteries?
My batteries are dead.
You're back. Okay, well then let's wrap it up fast and we'll talk again soon.
All right.
But I think we do have some practice here to make this more natural. I mean, I'm finding myself being polite for the sake of this format, because I think that's right in this format, and maybe it isn't. Maybe we need to be a little more, shoot from the hip.
Sure.
Good to talk to you, Steve. Yeah.
Thank you, David. And thank you.
Connect with us at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. Like and subscribe. And, for the 2 people or whomever that are watching, thank you. Have a great evening.